I don't often prefer the short story as a literary form, even though I actually did just post a review of a book of short stories. But at the time that I read this, I was in the mood for something a little whimsical and mercurial, so I picked up this book of a modern set of retellings of old fairy tales, and I thought that would do the trick. This is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, the wonderful English writer. Angela Carter is known for her, I mean, I guess whimsical is really an appropriate word, but she has sort of a unique place in British literature, and she also passed away at a really, really early age from breast cancer. I think she was just barely 50 or so. This book has 10 stories in it, all of which were based around fairy tales that we read or should have read as a child, including Bluebeard, Beauty and the Beast, Puss in Boots, Snow White, and Little Red Riding Hood. Most of them were really short, while one, the title story, The Bloody Chamber, is about 40 pages long or so. All of them are taken from the original source in the 17th century French writer Charles Perrault, whom Carter actually translated from the French into English, but these are not the direct translations. These are her literary retellings of the same stories. Of course, it can be really wonderful to go back and read stories that you haven't read in decades or had read to you. And that's a small part of this book's charm, but for me the greatest part of the book was the language. It's grandiloquent and rococo and big and coruscating and beautiful. It's the kind of language that's right at home in fairy tales, especially fairy tales retold for adults. And I feel this from the very first sentence of the first story, which I'll read to you. I love this writing, by the way. I remember how, that night, I lay awake in the wagon lit, in a tender, delicious ecstasy of excitement, my burning cheek pressed against the impeccable linen of the of the pillow, and the pounding of my heart mimicking that of the great pistons ceaselessly thrusting the train that bore me through the night, away from Paris, away from girlhood, away from the white, enclosed quietude of my mother's apartment, into the unguessable country of marriage. You might be able to tell from that sentence, too, that one of the preoccupations that Angela White has in this and some of her other work is the place of the woman and feminism, especially. She's really interested in that as far as her characters are concerned. And the thunderously operatic opening that opens up the swashbuckling retelling of Puss in Boots. Here's that. Figaro here, Figaro there, I tell you. Figaro upstairs, Figaro downstairs. And oh my goodness me, this little Figaro can slip into my lady's chamber, smart as you like, at any time whatsoever that he takes the fancy for, don't you know. He's a cat of the world, cosmopolitan, sophisticated. He can tell when a furry friend is the missus' best company. For what lady in all the world could say no to the passionate yet toujours advances of a fine marmalade cat? That coming out of the mouth of a cat sort of reminds me of my own cat, even though he's not a marmalade cat. It just makes me chuckle. How can you read a sentence like that and not be sucked into a story with a naive, childlike sense of expectation? I certainly couldn't, and that's why I wanted to review this book. Two things of note. As some other reviewers have said, you might want to pick up these stories and read them one at a time. There's just so much beauty in them and so much whimsy that if you sat down and read it cover to cover, which admittedly I did in a couple of days, and I probably shouldn't have done, it's just too much. It's overload, too much of a good thing. So the next time that I read them, and I almost certainly will read them again, I hope, I'll know to savor them instead, one by one, instead of just getting them all in one gulp. There's just too much imagination there. Also, several people mentioned, sometimes approvingly and sometimes not, her feminism, like I mentioned earlier. Her feminism isn't like the postmodern French feminism that I could sort of understand someone disliking, at least dislike reading about. It's a really smart, humorous, introspective look at the inner lives of girls and young women, which are most of her main characters. I thought it really a much wanted counterpoint to the inner lives of boys that we see in a lot of similar literature for young people. In fact, I think many of them would make fantastic bedtime stories for maybe. Well, there is some violence in some of them, so maybe not all of them for kids, but certainly for adults. I certainly liked reading them. The Bloody Chamber, a really quite wonderful book by Angela Carter.